Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Institute of Risk Management call. It is a shared call between the Switzerland interest group and, in this case, the Innovation SIG, and on a topic that is broadly appreciated at the moment, sustainability risk management. And when we from the Switzerland group decided that we want to address this topic, I reached out to Sarah, who is quite known in the area, is quite famous, I would say, meanwhile, about sustainability risk management. And I very much appreciated that she said, yes, I'm happy to give this speech. Why not bring this together with the Innovation SIG, who wants to start now also on a series of topics on sustainability risk management. And that it is a big topic is also seen, and particularly also for the Institute of Risk Management, it's a big topic. We can see also in the different interest groups like climate change or the newly founded ESG group. It is particularly for risk management a big topic. To introduce Sarah, for those who don't know her, I think she has quite an impressive background, and particularly she is a starter, obviously, because she is co-founder of so many companies and initiatives, particularly, of course, Setala, Responsible Raw Materials, Terabotics, ESGuide, like all these companies she helped to found and develop. But also her background is actually geoscience, planetary science, where she has a PhD. So welcome, Sarah. And just from a facilities perspective, of course, you are more than welcome to ask questions. Please use the question box or the chat. I will take these questions and then bring them after Sarah's presentation back to Sarah so that she can answer them. And with this, I hand over to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Pascal. And on behalf of the Innovation Special Interest Group, it is a true delight to be working in collaboration with yourselves. I think that when the SIGs and the RIGs get together within the Institute of Risk Management, it's always really exciting because we get to share lots of different perspectives and approaches, which is great. So as Pascal mentioned, so yes, that's a little bit about who I am. But with regards to sustainability, yes, I come from a raw materials or a geoscience background into the world of risk management. But I did that I started out life working within the mining sector as a geologist. I then went into the broader technical space, then into sustainability, so all of the different aspects of environmental, social, health and safety, and then the governance side as well, so the legal aspects. And it was after that that I went into risk management. And the reason why I went into risk management was because the company that I was working for really took sustainability seriously, and of course the technical side of the business seriously. But when all of the big decisions were being made around, say, acquisitions, etc., the people in the room were accountants and lawyers. So where were the different aspects of sustainability in those big decisions? And so I went into enterprise risk management because I saw that as a mechanism through which you can take all of these different types of risks, including sustainability, including technical, including financial, etc., and pull them all together to say where are the opportunities and threats. So Setala was formed to be an enterprise risk management consultancy that would help get the likes of sustainability into proper decision making. Now, the interesting thing over the last 2 years, so Setala was founded approximately 8 years ago, the interesting thing that's happened over the last couple of years is that this is almost reversed, because now the world is talking about true ESG and sustainability, but they don't know how to make it a reality. And of course, the easy answer is, well, risk management kind of helps with this. And so it's that story with regards to what do we actually mean by ESG. So I just flick back in a slide here. What do we actually mean with regards to ESG? But also, how do we then get risk management to help it make it a reality? Because you're not doing true enterprise risk management if you're not including the environment, the social, the governance aspects. But more on that in a second. So I'm going to start off with what do we actually mean by ESG or sustainability? And many people ask me, they say, Sarah, what's the difference between environment, social governance, or ESG, and sustainability? And there are many academics, especially within Europe, who spend a lot of time researching the differences between sustainability, corporate social responsibility, license to operate, ESG. But ultimately, from a risk perspective and from a business perspective, it's all the same kind of stuff. And if we go back to the 1980s, this was when there was a seminal paper called Our Common Future that was written by the United Nations. And within this paper, the definition for sustainable development was coined. And that's what almost, it wasn't the start of it because it had been around for a while, but it sparked a lot of development with regards to, okay, what does sustainability really mean to different businesses, to different parts of the world? And that definition that was afforded to this term sustainable development was development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So that was written back in 1987. And ostensibly, sustainable development really means the same thing with one minor twist. So instead of just protecting the planet on which we live, we also now tend to talk about looking for those opportunities to enhance the environment in which we live for future generations as well. So this is an indication here that whilst sustainable development and the whole professions that really surround this world have been around for a long time, they are evolving in their own right, and they're actually developing to encompass a lot of the opportunities that we begin to see here, rather than just managing some of the threats that we might pose to the environment and societies in which we live. So 1987, Our Common Future is quite a nice starting point through which we can understand what is meant by ESG, what is meant by sustainability. And within that paper and within the 1980s, ESG really was founded, or sustainability was really founded on three key pillars: social, environment, and economic. And you can see from the interpretations of what was meant by social, environment, and economic that these are very, very similar to how we talk about sustainability now. So on the social side, it's all about equity and diversity, participation by different people, empowerment of different people, social mobility, and of course that preservation and enhancement where possible of different cultures around the world. On the environmental side, big emphasis on biodiversity and natural resources, also aspects of clean air and water. You will notice that the term climate change doesn't feature in this particular slide. And that's because climate change, of course, was still gathering momentum, perhaps, in terms of the world's awareness back in the 1980s. Of course, it was always there. It's just that we weren't necessarily talking about it as much then as we do now. Now, on the economic side, the economic pillar often gets misinterpreted just to be talking about money and profit, whereas actually when we're talking about economics underneath the banner of sustainability, we're actually talking more about the distribution of wealth between different groups of people, different households, different aspects of society. We're talking about industrial growth, the efficient use of labour. So it is economics from a slightly different angle to how it is sometimes interpreted. So these were the three pillars of sustainability that were really utilised back in the 1980s. Many organisations still refer to these now because there's absolutely nothing wrong with them. However, sometimes people use slightly different language, slightly different terminology when referring to them. For example, if we cycle forwards into the 1990s, and this is where we have the advent of the 3 Ps, or people, planet, profit, really coming to the fore. And you will notice that people, planet, profit is just a slightly more eloquent way of talking about the social, environment, and economic side of things. So it's the same stuff. It's the same stuff that's coming to the fore. But the problem that John Elkington, who was the person to whom this is attributed, had with the profit line item was exactly the same problem that people had in the 1980s with the economic line item, in that people tend to default to saying, right, we're now talking about the money rather than the distribution of that wealth, which was the initial intention with regards to that line item. So then we cycle forwards into the 2000s, and this is where there was a workshop actually held, I think it was in 2017, by the OECD, where they really looked into the profit aspect of sustainability. And they said, people keep misinterpreting this, so let's call it prosperity instead. So now you tend to find people talking about people, planet, and prosperity rather than profit. So the triple bottom line, what are those different angles that come to being? Now, it really doesn't matter what words we use. The important thing is, how do we use all of this to encompass what is meant by sustainability? So we're talking about people and society, we're talking about the environment in which we live, and we're also talking about almost how do we distribute the wealth, how do we govern ourselves, etc., that comes into that prosperity angle that we have in that third circle of our triple Venn diagram that we have there. So this is one way of talking about sustainability, and many organizations use this. It's not necessarily an alternative way, but it's a different angle or a different direction in which we can look at it, is the Sustainable Development Goals, or are the Sustainable Development Goals, I should say. So the Sustainable Development Goals were launched by the United Nations back in 2015. They replaced the Millennium Development Goals, or the Millennium Goals, which, surprise, surprise, were launched in the year 2000. And the SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals, as you can see, encompass 17 really, really large ambitions, really. That's what they're all about. So they encompass everything from tackling global poverty through to hunger, diversity, life, be it on land or below the surface of the water, peace and justice, and of course, climate action. So all of this comes together, and this is really, for me, when I'm trying to think about what is the full breadth and depth of sustainability, this is the image that comes to my mind, because it is big, it is wide-ranging, and as we'll see as we go deeper into my presentation now, you'll see that they are all interconnected. So the key thing with regards to this is you can't just focus on one of them, because you need to be able to look at how will that goal, if you manage to achieve it, impact on all the ones round about it. So one of the main aspects here is, for example, if we just take climate action, which many people would think is the main component part that the world is focusing on at the moment, if all we do is lower our greenhouse gas emissions, and that's all we focus on, there is a very real danger that we could have a negative impact on global poverty, health, gender equality, clean water, etc., etc. I could circle all of them. So we need to be able to do this in balance. And a lot of that is at the heart of what people are beginning to term the just transition. So as we go through our energy transition, this green revolution that everybody's talking about, we need to be able to do it in a just manner. And that word just is used in one way to expand our thinking out from just thinking about climate change to the entirety of our Sustainable Development Goals. But more on that in a second. So we've got sustainable development being coined back in 1987. We've then got the Sustainable Development Goals here in 2015, but the latest iteration, or the terminology that is being used most widely at the moment, is that of ESG. Now, ESG very simply stands for environment, social, and governance. So that's what the ESG stands for. It's just talking about sustainability. It's all the same kind of stuff rolled together, but ESG provides us with a little bit more structure, perhaps, to be able to talk about it. So what do we actually mean by these three areas of ESG? Well, when we start to talk about the environment, depending on our organization and what we do and where we are in the world, it could mean anything from what kind of biodiversity do we have in the world round about us, and how do we conserve or how do we enhance that biodiversity? What about water? Do we have too much? Do we have too little? What about the quality of the water in that area in which we are operating or in which we are living? What about climate change and weather? How is that? What kind of impacts does that have the potential to have on us, both today, tomorrow, and also 30 years, 50 years, 100 years into the future? What does this really look like? And then perhaps getting a bit more personal about it, depending on what kind of activities we're undertaking. how do we make use of the land in which we are operating? Are we an agricultural company? Are we a mining company? Are we building a factory? Are we building roads? Are we building railways? Are we building houses? What is it that we actually want to do on that land? And also, is that land designated as being a World Heritage Site or something like that? So what kind of protections do we have in that particular area, which then of course takes us very neatly into permits and various different types of environmental permits that we might need in order to be able to operate. Also, we need to be thinking about what we're doing. So do we know how to rehabilitate that land, that environment as we go? And are we undertaking an activity that requires some form of closure at the end? Can we view that closure as an opportunity to improve things rather than just stop bad things from happening with regards to that area? And of course, with that, we also have the need to manage our waste. And with waste, again, we have opportunities and threats. Are we producing lots of hazardous waste? And so therefore, what do we do with it to make sure it doesn't hurt future generations? Or perhaps with regards to that waste, there's an opportunity to recycle it or develop new technology that might actually attribute a value to that waste rather than just seeing it as a negative thing that we have to be able to deal with. So these are only some of the different thoughts and the aspects that you might consider, and indeed risks that you might consider when you're thinking about the environmental component part of ESG. So what about the social part? So social is when we talk about people, and we're talking about people both in the immediate communities around which we are working, but also within broader society as well. So with regards to that, people always have some form of expectation for shared value, and that is the, well, what's in it for you and what's in it for me in terms of this business or organizational activity that we might be undertaking. So what are these expectations or perceptions even of shared value if we enact some form of change within the environment that we're working? And with that, of course, we have different types of social impacts. Some of this, of course, may result in things like local procurement, local hiring, the community granting access to a site, because with any project that's going on around the world, if you have somebody protesting, everything grinds to a halt. So how do you manage all of that? But also, if you say, for example, you're developing a facility somewhere where there's no infrastructure, by creating some form of site access, that might be really good for the local community, because now they've got a road or a railway track or something like that, therefore providing them with enhanced communication and transportation that maybe they didn't have before. Similarly, with regards to this, you might be able to provide them with different forms of power. So I work a lot with the mining sector, and a lot of those mines, especially the new ones, are a long way from anywhere. There will be communities in the local region, and all the power that they have currently typically comes from diesel engines or something like that, rather than renewable forms of power. So if we're building new infrastructure, how can we do that with the long term in mind, rather than just building a coal-fired power station, which, whether you believe in climate change or not, is going to get more and more difficult to operate, purely because it's going to get more expensive because of all of the carbon prices, etc., that will be slapped on top of it. So we also have within the social space, again, lots of stakeholder engagement. So having the empathy and the dialogue with all of those different parties, many of whom may disagree with one another, let alone what you're trying to do as an organisation. And of course, you've got your health and safety, both of the community, but also of your own employees as well, and making sure that you've got their welfare front of mind with regards to anything that you're doing. That then quite neatly takes us on into the governance aspect of ESG, which is perhaps the most difficult bit to define, especially in some jurisdictions around the world. This word governance tends to mean different things. And it's complicated because governance is really all about almost the culture of the organization in which you are working. And it incorporates both the corporate governance, but also international and national governance and government as well. So if you are operating in a very well-governed jurisdiction, then you probably are operating within a good framework that allows you to make sure that you do have things like equal pay, some form of diversity, you will have good health and safety, etc., because it's built into how that country runs. Whereas if you're operating in a part of the world that perhaps doesn't have such mature forms of national governance, then you as an organization, that mandate for you to be able to create that safe working environment, etc., isn't supported as robustly by that national governance. So therefore, you have to roll all of that into what you do naturally. You're not going to get rewarded by that government for doing things properly because it's not within their code of conduct, as it were, but you as that international organization, it's actually the emphasis is on you to be able to create that safe working environment in which you pay your taxes and everything else. Which takes us into the corporate governance side of governance, and that is basically how do you run your business, how do you run your organization, and that varies because it includes everything from how is the board structured and run, so what's this level of diversity, how quickly do people turn over on the board, do they have the right experience, do they have the right competencies, do they actually challenge the organization, or do they just sit there and tick things off or sign their names at the end of various different reports, which of course we hope doesn't happen. But also within this, what are the ethics of the business? And that will include things like, are you paying your taxes on time? What kind of levels of compliance do you adhere to? What kind of levels of how do you engage with your different stakeholders, be they shareholders or be they suppliers, for example? What does all of this look like? So the key thing with regards to ESG is that the E, the S and the G will look slightly different depending on what your business or what your organization actually does. And historically, the E, the S and the G have almost been managed separately. And that is in part because to manage the environmental aspects of an organization, it takes quite different skill sets compared to managing the social aspects or the governance aspects. Now, governance typically sits in the lands of the lawyers, and so often that will be being managed at quite a senior level in an organisation. And often the consultants for the governance part of this will charge an awful lot of money to be able to help because they'll be from the legal side. Whereas if you go to the social side of things or the environmental side of things, those experts will probably be buried much, much deeper within an organization. If you are something like a big manufacturing company, they're probably going to be closer to the front line, perhaps, than the lawyers are. And again, the consultancies that help those areas are probably going to be charging slightly less compared to the lawyers. So almost the marketplace with regards to E, S and G historically has been pretty fragmented with regards to those skill sets and those understandings. And so what has been happening over very, very quickly over the last year or so is we're beginning to see all of these areas properly come together. And you can see I've tentatively drawn my now line as we go through time here, going from left to right, to show that these three areas are beginning to come together. But in most organizations, they aren't a cohesive package yet. So you're not seeing the full integration of environment, social and governance yet beginning to appear. And this means that there are massive opportunities in front of us, in part because a lot of the different ESG key areas of risk, such as water, you could argue, and actually if you look at the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, you can see that actually they categorize things like water scarcity. One year it might be an environmental risk, the next year it might be a societal risk. So it hops backwards and forwards between those different categories. And that is because one person's risk might be somebody else's cause or consequence, etc. And so you can see the emphasis beginning to change. And within ESG, it is really important to be able to see all of those different ESGs as an interconnected whole, as a network. And it goes beyond that because we can't just look at the ESG aspects of a business in a silo or in isolation. We need to be able to pull them out into the full context of our organizational environment. So we need to be able to line them up against things like our financial risk management, our technical risk management, our reputation risk management. So we have to be able to pull it all together. And this is sounding bizarrely like enterprise risk management, isn't it? Where everything is interconnected and we just need to be able to pull out what are the most important nodes. So the thing to remember here is that sustainability itself is interconnected and becoming more so. You can't just look at one aspect of sustainability in isolation, because that doesn't work very well. You can put in place a lovely project to build a school for a community, but you need to be able to think about that over the long term and to make sure that there are actually teachers for that school and the different utilities for that school. There's no point in just building the structure and expecting the community to get on with it. You need to be able to think about this in the round, in the entirety, and to look at all of the opportunities and threats that are in there. So this world of ESG, this world of sustainability is here, it is interconnected, but it's also changing very quickly as well. So this is one of the reasons why it is very much front of mind for lots of organizations right now. And this is in part because what we're talking about here is a just transition. The fact that climate change is here and coming at us very, very quickly has applied a timeline or a ticking clock to sustainability. If we just go back and think about our sustainable development goals, everybody can say, oh yes, that's lovely. Somebody's stuck an arbitrary timeline of 2030 to be able to achieve all of this stuff. And I think most people secretly think, huh, we've got no chance. The problem that we have now, though, is that climate change is here. But most people believe that it is real. And so therefore, that means that if our global temperature goes above 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, we have significant problems, not just because we're going to see small island states begin to disappear beneath the Earth's oceans, but if we go much beyond that 1.5 degrees, the likes of the Netherlands, for example, will start to have massive problems. And we're going to have to start spending huge volumes of cash on very significant infrastructure to be able to deal with our changing environment in which we live that is being driven by our changes in global temperature. So this just transition says it's not just about the climate change, it's about all of sustainability, but it is climate change that is applying the ticking clock to the speed with which we need to be able to achieve a lot of this. So the just transition, really, really important. Integration into the broader sustainability piece is really important. But ultimately, at the end of the day, what everybody tends to be asking, and this was certainly true of COP26 when I had the luxury of being there in the negotiation rooms and seeing what was being discussed. The real question that perhaps not everybody voices is actually, okay, this is lovely, but what's in it for me? So what? What does this actually mean? Because everybody has their own personal interpretations and their own personal needs with regards to what is going on in the world and their own futures. Because for some people, it's all about the science. It's all about saying, oh, help, Western Antarctica is melting very, very, very quickly. And if we go past a certain tipping point, then we will see the Earth's oceans increase significantly. So for some people, it is the science. For other people, it's just society and beliefs within society round about them. And of course, a lot of this gets blamed perhaps on the millennials. Well, the oldest millennials are now 40 years old, which therefore means that they actually make up quite a lot of the world's population and also quite a lot of the world's workforce and quite a lot of the world's investment money. So the millennials are here. I'm not saying that anybody older than 40 is obviously nasty because they don't believe in all of this stuff, but you've got a mass of people who are predominantly thinking that sustainability is something that's really important, and so therefore they will actively put their hard-earned cash into investment funds that take this stuff seriously. And I'll come on to greenwashing in a second, but they want to take this stuff seriously. So for some people it's the science, for some people it's society and what your peers, for example, are doing. For some people it is the money, and this is a picture here from one of the early days in COP26 that obviously happened in Glasgow a month or so ago. And this is Mark Carney. This is just before he said, by the way, the governments of the world have pledged or are trying to get together to pledge $100 billion worth of cash to help us with our energy transition. Well, I'm going to trump that and I'm going to put $130 trillion of private money on the table. So this was a case here of the financial institutions of the world saying, okay, well, actually, we're going to step up and we're going to make sure that all of our financial decisions take climate change into account. And with that, I read in sustainability, not just climate change. Now, you could be really cynical and say that the only reason this is happening is because most financial decisions, or sorry, many financial risks that are out there, or to rephrase that, if our climate does change or continues to change, then much of our money is in jeopardy in terms of where it is currently residing unless we do something about it. That might be the background driver behind this, rather than anything to do with the science. It's all about how risky is our cash in terms of where it's sitting at the moment. So for some people, it's about the money and some of the changes that are coming along with that. For some people, it's the rules, and we're seeing every government around the world, every international organization is slapping down more rules, more regulations, more guidelines, more standards, and they're all moving in a similar direction, which is the greenification of the world. So what does all of this mean? Of course, this then comes very neatly into the world of compliance. But with all of this, the problem that we have is that all of these rules, these regulations, these guidelines are changing incredibly rapidly. And what you can see on this slide here, so this just runs from 2013 through to vaguely about now, these international guidelines with regards to ESG are all relevant to the extractive sector. So I've just pulled out one sector. And what you can see here is just the sheer volume of regulations and changes that we have to be aware of when we are thinking about ESG. So for some people, the driver to take this seriously is because there is a rule or a regulation that's telling us we have to take it seriously. They might not believe in the science, and that doesn't matter anymore. The fact is that we now have to do it because the regulators, for example, are telling us we need to go there. Or perhaps our investors can't invest in us unless we can show our ESG credibility. Also, with regards to this, for some people, it might just be the desire to have stuff or technology or be able to drive a car. And for many of us, I'm sure, who have dialed into today's call, we live in countries or in jurisdictions that have pledged to electrify the driving fleet of that particular country within the next 10, 20, 30 years. So for example, within the UK, the British government has pledged to say that our entire driving fleet will move to electric vehicles by the time we get to 2050, with no more combustion engines being sold after 2030. That's really, really close. In order to be able to deliver on this, however, the UK, for the UK's fleet alone, and remember, we're quite a small country really, and in terms of driving, we can only drive around in circles. We can't really go that far without being able to get on a boat or drive through a tunnel. So what does this mean? This means that for the UK to be able to move from combustion engines to electric vehicles over the next 30 years, the UK needs to be able to get hold of 2/3 of the world's cobalt, half of the world's copper, all of the world's dysprosium, and 3/4 of the world's lithium. I've got those statistics slightly wrong, but it's more or less that. Now that is huge, and that's just for the UK, and that is just for the physical vehicles. That doesn't talk about the amount of copper that we need to go into wind turbines in order to be able to generate the energy that can then power the electric vehicles. And the problem with an electric vehicle is that an electric vehicle currently, given the current technology we have, is double the weight of a combustion driven vehicle. So therefore it requires more energy to go forwards, or perhaps stop as well. So you need more energy to go into our electric vehicles. So this just then compounds and compounds and compounds what is actually required in order to be able to achieve this energy transition. Now, some of that is being discussed at the likes of COP26, so certainly the big targets, certainly the reduction in coal and oil and gas. Some things that aren't being discussed at the moment is where are all those raw materials actually going to come from? If we need to be able to increase the world's production of lithium by multiple orders of magnitude, how are we going to do that, especially given the fact that it typically takes 30 years to bring a new mine online? It takes that long to design it, to get all the paperwork in order, to actually dig it or to construct the mine, and that is before you start getting useful lithium out of that hole in the ground. So there's a disconnect in some of these parts with regards to our supply chains in terms of, are we going to be able to achieve some of these targets? So all of which, of course, throws up huge uncertainty and therefore lots of potential threats and, of course, opportunity. So how do we move from this potential world, as Greta would say, of blah, 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 into a world of positive change through action? I've just been sitting in calls earlier on today where people basically went, oh, it's all too hard. We've just screwed it all up. We can't do it. And yeah, you can take that attitude, but I think it's a little bit more exciting to say, okay, look, this is really, really tough in terms of what we need to do. How do we all come to the table? How do we build that interconnected network of what can finance do to make it a reality? What can governments do to make ESG a reality? What can the raw materials producers, what can the innovators, what can the scientists, what can the engineers, what can society, what can we all be doing in order to make ESG a reality, rather than just a whole load of targets that we go sailing through, at which point in time, yes, we will need to build boats or certainly change the way in which we as a society, a global society, actually lives. So where do we get into some solutions? And this is the exciting bit, because most of us on this call are risk managers. And so we need a mechanism through which we can tie everything together in a network, and we can say, okay, that thing over there is an opportunity for you and a threat for you. So on balance, which way do we want to push it? And this bit over here is an opportunity or a threat. How do we tie all of this stuff together? Well, of course, the answer is enterprise-wide integrated risk management, also known as ERM, or enterprise risk management, which is really exciting because, of course, enterprise risk management is all about looking at all of these different threats and opportunities across an organization, stitching them together, making very sure that people really are looking not just at the downside, which, of course, if you come at risk management, say, from a traditional health and safety perspective, you're going to think about risks as being just threats. So sometimes there's that mindset shift that you have to go through to switch you into the opportunity stance. And then similarly, say, for example, I mean, I started out life as an exploration geologist, so I always see uncertainty as being a really exciting and good thing, because I might find something that nobody else has seen before, but then I have to be reminded that actually there are some threats involved as well. If we look at all these risks and we manage to stitch them all together and look at the total value of risk management, now we're beginning to talk. Yes, how do we do all of this? And I realize I'm preaching to the world's experts on it, but if you take any of our international standards, they all boil down into pretty much more or less 4 steps. So number 1, what is the context in which we're trying to operate and how is it changing along with our objectives that we're trying to achieve? What are the risks that we might face? Which are the important ones that we need to do something about? How do we manage them? And then let's monitor, review and report on them, all going around in a nice little iterative cycle, which therefore means that we can pull together all of those different disciplines that we work with. And the reason why having a really simple enterprise risk management process is really important. So I mean simple rather than a super complicated one with 25 steps instead of 4, is because the world of health and safety, they need to be able to add in their own nuances in terms of how they talk about risk management, how they actually deliver on some of their different aspects, which will be different to financial risk management. So how do we stitch all of that together? We also need to be able to do it throughout the entirety of our organisation. So it's not just something that is reserved for the executive level and then we let people in the front line get on with it in a different way. We need to be able to stitch all of this together because, of course, we need to be able to pull in all our different aspects as a network. And the key thing with this is that your enterprise risk management is not complete unless you have your ESG incorporated into it. Again, over the past year, in fact, less so now, people have said to me, they said, oh, you're an expert in enterprise risk management. So do you also do ESG? And it sort of makes me chuckle slightly because actually, if you're not already incorporating ESG into your enterprise risk management, then you've been missing a big part of that jigsaw puzzle, or perhaps a big slice of your cake. Now, with this, of course, we need to make sure we're thinking about everything over time. We're not just thinking about our short-term risks. We need to be thinking about those slow burners that might only come to fruition hundreds of years into the future, especially when we're talking about climate change. But what are the things that we need to be doing now in order to be able to preempt some of that long-term change? And of course, everything is a nice little network that we have going on here. So how do we actually make some of this a reality? And I'm just going to finish up this presentation before I open up for questions, and please do feel free to pop questions into the questions box in the GoToWebinar panel. I'm going to finish up with saying, right, what are some hints and tips to actually make ESG a reality by doing your risk management? And just to reiterate again that your enterprise risk management profile is not complete without ESG. So suggestion number one is to remember that risk often means something very different to different people. So within health and safety, of course, people often, they're talking about hazards. They have very strict ways of talking about risk management that is brilliant. But when you then try and draw it into that broader business approach, sometimes we end up with little niggles, or things don't quite work when we're trying to compare and contrast a health and safety risk with a financial risk, which of course they will be stitched together. But how do you work out what are the best controls that could be put into place? So a health and safety person will talk about risk in one way. An environmental expert will talk about risk in a very different way. Often they're talking about, say, a factory's potential impact on the environment, and that will be the direction of risk that that environmental expert will think about, which is interesting because an engineer will probably be thinking about the environmental impact on the factory that they're building. So these experts will be thinking about risks in different directions and from different angles. A social expert will do something called a materiality assessment. Now, a materiality assessment for a social expert is all about going and speaking and listening to members of the community, different stakeholders, different shareholders, and say, what do you think the risks are for this organization or a decision that we might be about to make? So a materiality assessment for a social expert is something that is very, very specific. And rather annoyingly, a materiality assessment for a social expert is different to when a financial person talks about material risks. So the key learning from this is that we all use the same words to mean something different. And even in that world of ESG, because the environmental, the social, and the governance people haven't really worked together that well in the past, they haven't worked out how to share the same language yet, or to share what they really mean. Because of course, it doesn't matter what your organization does, we're all interconnected, we're all trying to share our thoughts, our feelings, our perceptions, our opportunities, our threats. How do we stick all of them together? And then we need to be able to look at the world through the eyes of that social expert and say, okay, so for you, these are the really big risks, whereas for the CEO, that frame of reference is going to be slightly different compared to somebody outside of the organization. And so enterprise risk management helps this group of people by saying, well, let's look at all of it together, and then be able to show it's almost like an empathy map. So how do you impact on somebody else and vice versa? So hint number one is that everybody talks about risk in a different way, and we need to acknowledge that as the risk management team and say, okay, look, you are all going to use the same words and mean different things by them. Let's just respect the different terminology that's used, understand the intent, capture that and move on, rather than struggle for years and years and years to have the argument over who owns the word materiality. The second hint is that different approaches to risk management are used by different people. And this is where I'm really going to stick my neck out here, because I'm going to show impact against likelihood, and I'm going to suggest that likelihood doesn't work very well for many ESG risks. I'm not going to go diving into the pros and cons of likelihood. But what tends to work really nicely in the world of ESG is you take that, you respect those very traditional ways of doing risk management, you say they are fantastic, I'm going to put it to one side for the moment, and instead I'm going to focus on, here is a risk, do we need to do something about it? And so that's why on the right hand side of this slide here, on the y-axis, I've actually gone for, is action actually needed? This therefore allows you to take your different risks and to be able to position them on this graph and to be able to say, yep, there are some risks that are really important, such as the one that I've just drawn now, really important, but you know what, we can't do anything about it. So therefore we're not going to take any action, and we're going to accept that we're going to have to tolerate it. Whereas there might be other risks, okay, which might be really important, and they are things that we need to be doing something about right now. So therefore it goes up in the top right hand corner. This immediately gets around a whole load of the complexity and the problems that we have when we're using our impact likelihood grids, and gets us, most importantly, into the world of action really, really, really fast. Now, we can follow all of this up with the more detailed risk analysis, and that's fine. But in the world of, especially when you're trying to pull together social and governance and environment, ditching the likelihood bit and just getting cracking with the action bit really, really helps. Otherwise, you find you have the most almighty arguments about likelihood and relative different types of impacts. Whereas if you go for action first, it gets you going much faster. So that's just a hint to throw out there. Also, as well, different teams will use different metrics, different data sets. The traditional data that gets used most often in terms of environment and social risk management, especially, I'm going to leave governance off to one side for the moment, is where we have human beings collecting data internally within an organization. Okay, so it fits in this top left-hand box within this diagram of different types of data. So most information is done with a flip chart and somebody going out and checking a sensor or something like that and logging it. Every so often, if we're lucky, there may be an external audit that is undertaken, but they are less usual from a governance aspect compared to, say, financial external audits. So there's not the kind of the architecture in terms of roles and responsibilities, etc., that is focused in on the ESG space to the same degree that might be the case in the world of finance. The really nice opportunity that's coming through at the moment is to, of course, use machines, use things like the Internet of Things, use satellites, etc., to be able to collect more data, both with regards to what's going on internally within the organization and then get independent and verifiable data. So, for example, a satellite can now be able to detect or measure, I should be able to say, the emissions being emanating from a factory. So that's a case where you can go and ask somebody to provide you internally with, okay, what do you think your greenhouse gas emissions are? You can then go and check if they are correct by going to that satellite. So you're getting that verification that's going on with regards to that data, which is really, really nice. And that is technology that is developing incredibly quickly. So with this, there are different metrics that are used by different teams, and what we're aiming for is for all of this to be shared and for us to say, okay, well, actually, how can I get a better handle on my ESG risks? How are they changing by bringing all of this together? The final example that I'm going to give you in terms of different techniques and tools that are used is this concept of control. So lots of different professions and lots of different disciplines use the word control in different ways. And so, as is defined by ISO, a control is ISO defines it as being a measure that effectively modifies the risk. And instead of using the word measure, because that's very confusing when we translate it into a different language, we could say, okay, it's a task, an object, or a system, or a thing that will change, that will modify a risk. Now, the problem that we often have is that the word control is often translated as just checking something rather than changing something. It doesn't help that ISO then gives examples to say that a policy might be a control. Well, a policy can be a control if somebody uses it, but if it's just written and then left on a shelf, it doesn't do anything to change our risks. And so I've included this little diagram here, which is just a quick cheat on, is the thing I'm looking at actually a control or not? And what this allows us to do is to say, okay, this thing that I'm looking at here, and by the way, the reason that I'm showing this is that in the world of social and environment and governance, they all define controls in different ways. So if this thing that I'm calling a control, if all it's doing is collecting data, if you do nothing with that data, it's not going to change the risk. So therefore, it's not a control in its own right. Okay, you need to be able to do something with the data. And that's important because then when an auditor comes along and checks that it's actually working, they need to be checking that someone is using the data, not is somebody just collecting it. The second thing that we have here is if the thing that you're doing is only providing guidance to someone, so if it's a standard or if it's training or if it's listening to an alarm, that's delightful. But again, unless somebody does something with it, it's not going to change the risk. So what this little diagram here does is it serves to pull together the environmental experts, the social experts, the governance experts to say, is what you're doing actually changing the risks at hand? Or are you just churning out paperwork because you think that's what you need to do? So there's a massive array of shuffling that's going on within ESG at the moment to make sure it's not just greenwashing or blah, 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 and we are actually controlling our risks, we are actually changing what's going on. So that then takes us into step number 3 very nicely, to say that often an environmental risk will not be controlled by the environmental team, and that's because we work in a network, and whilst the environmental team might be going, oh look, there's an extreme weather event over the horizon over there, it's actually the engineering team who are probably the ones that can change something with regards to the organisation to fix it. So this is where our enterprise risk management comes in really nicely to help us with this. Similarly, we can look to the world of finance, and this launch, I know it's been around for a few years now, but the launch of TCFD, or the Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosure. And what this is doing is immediately dragging ESG up to the top level of an organisation, because suddenly companies can't get the finance that they need unless they are actually meeting TCFD, and the financiers can't provide the finance, etc., unless they can show what's going on with regards to how they are actually managing their climate change risks within their portfolio. More on that in a separate talk if anybody wants to come onto it later. So the fourth thing, and don't worry, I've only got 5, is that often the E and the S, the environment and the social, have been buried at the bottom of an organisation. And this is where risk management can help to elevate them up. So often the environmental team have been left to their own devices, as have the social team. They've had tiny, tiny little budgets. They've managed to do some really great work, but they've very rarely been considered in the upper echelons of decision making. So that's the traditional way of looking at it. So risk management can help to pull those aspects up to be a much more influential and much more important part of the organisation. And the final aspect that I have here is that ESG itself, so sustainability, can in turn elevate risk management. So where we've seen in organizations, people go, oh yeah, the risk management team is buried somewhere within finance. Suddenly, with sustainability coming along, the board and the senior executives are saying, oh, we need this ESG thing. Oh, and the Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosure is saying you have to have this enterprise risk management thing. How do we do that? So ESG in its own right is actually elevating risk management within an organization as well, which is really exciting. So in summary, number 1, ESG is just the latest term for sustainability. Okay, so it's just the latest reiteration of that terminology. It doesn't really matter how you look at it. The latest changes with regards to regulations, societal expectations, mean that even if you don't believe in the science, and I speak to people every day who say to me climate change isn't real, even if you don't believe that it's not real, the regulations are now here, so you have to take it seriously, because otherwise you're going to lose all of your funding very, very quickly. Okay, you might not lose it in 2021, but you will lose it in 2023. It's here, it's happening. The focus is increasingly on impact and action and seeing where you can create a positive change. Gone are the days, or going are the days, where you can write a policy and say, yeah, done. Or you can do some scenario analysis and say, done. You actually have to act on it. You have to show where your strategy is changing to make this real. And the final 2 points there, your enterprise risk management is not complete without your ESG, but also you can't do ESG without having some form of enterprise risk management, or certainly integrated and interconnected risk management in place within your organization. And with that, I will say thank you very, very much. Also as well, if I flick all the way back to the beginning of my presentation while Pascal comes on, if any of you are interested in picking up the slides that I've just been through over the course of the last 50 minutes or so, please do feel free to go to this link at the bottom of the page here, because that will be able to give you a free version of the slides that I've just been through. So with that, thank you very much, and I'll open for any questions. Thanks, Pascal.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for introducing into sustainability, ESG, and all the surroundings, and particularly how this fits into enterprise risk management. I think quite important nowadays, like you said, really enterprise risk management without considering sustainability is quite tough, and the other way around, obviously. We have time for a couple of questions. We do have a few questions that show that the audience is quite into the topic. So I just read out the first question. Where in the ESG structure does the prosperity or economic pillars of the PPP or our common future vision fit? Is that intended readership of the two are different, like ESG for the private sector, PPP for the public sector, or how do you see this?
That's a really good question. So you can actually match the two together. So the PPP and the ESG. So the planet fits with environment, the people fits with the society, and the prosperity or the profit fits kind of with the governance bit. That's where they tend to kind of mesh together. So it's the same stuff, and you will hear slightly different language being used by different sectors, but at the end of the day we're all talking about the same stuff. So it's not necessarily something where it's intended for different readerships or they are different in any way. It's all they come down to the same principles that you have there. But that's a really good question. Thanks, Anthony.
The next one, how do you change the multiple world cultures when society is fracturing at a fast rate? When this requires the masses to make the change, not the few.
How long have you got, Andrew? That's an amazing question. So I think, I mean, this is something here where it comes back to the Sustainable Development Goals, and it comes back to the respect that is needed for all of the different cultures of the world. And so, I mean, if I go back to COP26, this was something here where you put yourself in the shoes and socks of some of those negotiators. And you've got people who are coming from very rich countries, you've got people who are coming from very poor countries, and the rich countries are being asked for money, and they're thinking, well, hang on a second, I've spent hundreds of years raising this cash or developing and doing everything right. Why should I give it all away? And it is very, very interesting seeing, well, hang on a second, we will benefit as a globe much better if we share some of that around. And that is the thought that sits behind the just transition. And I'm not doing a very good job of trying to describe this, but the just transition is all about, okay, so we've got $100 billion that have been pledged by different countries around the world. So let's stick with that one. How and where do we spend it? So how do we make sure that we can utilize the challenge that is climate change to meet some of the opportunities that are needed to be achieved through things like tackling world poverty? i.e., how can we take some of that cash and pay it to the developing nations of the world to try and perhaps bring them out of the levels of poverty that they might be in? Now, this is me I sound very kind of high and mighty in terms of the words that I'm using, and I don't mean it in that way in the slightest. But like, one of the solutions that we've got is that, so we're going to need lots and lots of raw materials. Many of those raw materials will come from places like Africa, Asia, South America, etc. Provided we can prove that we can extract those minerals in a responsible manner, i.e. using ESG or sustainability principles, we should be paying market value for them. And so therefore that cash should be going to those societies. The key thing there is obviously making sure that the governance is strong enough, and that actually that those funds and that money does go to where it's actually needed, rather than being siphoned off somewhere along the route. I'm not entirely sure that I'm really answering your question, Andrew, but I think this is a case here where there are many, many, many issues that are being had, but perhaps as a planet, we've only got one planet, and it's quite a small rock that is flying through space very quickly. We're very fragile, and actually, if climate change really is real and we don't get this right, we really have killed ourselves off. We're not going to hurt the planet. Planet Earth will be fine, but the human race will be gone. So there's an alignment factor here, and an opportunity to use it to try and tackle some of those other really big problems across the world. That was an attempt at an answer.
Maybe the next one fits pretty well to this, like your personal opinion, obviously. Do you consider that globalization has contributed to the climate crisis? And if so, in what way?
These are great questions. I think, well, no, I mean, it depends how you interpret globalization, actually. I mean, I think that climate change is a global problem. And for example, if the UK decides, yes, and Switzerland, for example, decides we're going to do everything that's needed, but all the other countries of the world, or India and China and America and Australia, etc., decide we don't actually really care about it, then we're still going to have a big problem with climate change. So actually globalization is needed in order to be able to combat climate change. So from that angle, it's a good thing. Of course, the increased travel and what have you, in terms of people being able to work all over the world, etc., that's been a negative input towards climate change, because it's pumped lots of greenhouse gases, etc., into the atmosphere. You can see which side of this fence I fall, and I think that globalization is a good thing, because I think it allows us to collaborate and innovate better than we might otherwise be able to do. And we're going to need an awful lot of that over the next 30 years if we have a semblance of a chance to be able to combat this. But Anita, thank you very much for that question. That is a good one, and I shall think about it further.
We have a few more questions that we unfortunately can't address today, but one big question. So obviously you got a new fan, big shout out to your great presentation. The question, where can people see more from you talking about the topic?
So either come along to our website, so www.satala.com, so that's SATARLA.com, or join the Innovation Special Interest Group if you're not already a member. We're going to be, our theme or our topic of conversation and discussion for the next 9 months or so is going to be sustainability, responsibility, ESG, and we're very much going to be working, we're going to be very complimentary of the ESG SIG, but do come along and join us for those discussions. So you can either go to our company website, you can join the Innovation Special Interest Group, or if you're really interested in raw materials and that's what you want to learn more about, then our charity, which is just www.responsiblerawmaterials.com, feel free to go and take a look at that, or come and find me on LinkedIn and I'll send you all of those links again.
Thank you very much. Also, just again, the IRM is very much into the sustainability related topics. Also, we have the climate change interest group. We have, like Sarah said, the ESG interest group. Feel free to join if you're interested in the topic, and contribute accordingly. I'm sorry for those whose answers we can't, whose questions we can't answer today, but please reach out to Sarah, and she's more than happy to talk to you about the details then. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you very much, Sarah, for presenting and bringing us the topic. And what is left for me is have a good holidays, enjoy your time and stay healthy so that we meet again next year. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much,
Bye.
Pascal. Thanks, everyone.